morning, and welcome to the Saturday plenary session for the 2022 annual meeting of the Linguistic Society of America. I'm John Baugh, and that's our signer, our interpreter. It's my honor to introduce our speaker, Tracy Weldon. Tracy received her BA in French and English from Furman University and received her PhD in linguistics from The Ohio State University. She joined the faculty of the University of South Carolina in 2000 after having spent the previous 5 years with the English department at the faculty of North Carolina State University. And she holds a joint appointment in the English department and the program in linguistics at the University of South Carolina, where she teaches both undergraduate and graduate courses in linguistics. She has served as the Associate Dean for Diversity and Interdisciplinary Programs in Social Sciences in the College of Arts and Sciences, and she currently serves as the University of South Carolina's Dean of the Graduate School and Vice Provost for Graduate Education. A great deal of her work is in quantitative sociolinguistics, and she specializes in American dialects with a particular focus on Gullah and African American English. She's published extensively in many of our major scholarly journals: American Speech, the Journal of Sociolinguistics, Language Variation and Change in Language, and her most recent book, MiddleClass African American English, was published by Cambridge University Press in 2021. That's the information she shared with me. I'm now going to go off script in a very personal way because I've known Tracy for a very long time. This is a very special introduction for me for many reasons, because of the fact that Tracy is an exceptional person and a remarkable scholar for a variety of reasons. But I want to give a couple of shout outs that go way back that explain why she and I are here today. The field of linguistics, when I began studying in 1972, did not have a great deal of African American representation. Thanks primarily to the work of William LeBove, who was my mentor, and Walt Wolfram, who was one of the people that Tracy worked with, there were growing numbers of African and African American scholars. But anyone raised in the United States today knows the importance of the subcultures in our society and the role that women play in those subcultures. But there is no more important segment of the African American community than the mothers, sisters, and women who are the backbone of our community and have been since the inception of slavery. Black women who have overcome tremendous obstacles to achieve the various accomplishments that represent their success over time. And we will see some of that played out today. So in addition to being a linguist and an extraordinary scholar, Tracy Weldon is a mother, she's a wife, she's a sister. She represents the African American experience in exceptional ways. I would be remiss if I did not mention that she and my mother and Kamala Harris are an AKA. Yes, I am the son of an AKA. And they are represented, and if you're not wearing pink and green, and shame on me because I'm not, I should be. But Tracy is a standout for an important reason. Those of us in sociolinguistics, especially if you entered the field when I entered the field, we tried very much to learn from our mentors, and Bill LeBove introduced the concept of contextual styles, which was designed to emulate natural speech, right? His contextual styles focus different levels of attention, and there's a controversy over his decision to use the question regarding the danger of death as a way to simulate the most natural conversation that people have. And I remember years ago trying to interview my own family members, and the mistake that I made with my mother, my father, and others was I conducted a traditional sociolinguistic interview. It was artificial. It was awful. You will never hear them. They will never see the light of day because the interviews were that bad. The genius of Tracy's contribution is that she didn't conduct interviews with African Americans where she was a full participant. They are natural conversations. I remember hearing one and it dawning on me that she was talking about the price of childcare. Well, what American family doesn't think about their kids and their money and how to take care of them? It was absolutely amazing. But through that window of recording natural conversations, she wasn't mimicking natural speech. She was participating in natural speech. And it's because of I don't know whether you had like a brilliant, at any rate, that was just absolute genius. We have all benefited from it, especially as it shows up in your book. And I've taken too much of her time, but she deserves the introduction she's receiving today. Without further ado, my friend, my colleague, Dr. Tracy Weldon.
Good morning, and thank you, Dr. Baugh, for that incredible introduction. It leaves me speechless, so it's a good thing I have something written down. Thank you all for being here this morning, both virtually and in person. I'm honored to have this opportunity to share my research in this plenary forum, and even more honored to be introduced by, I think, our now new LSA president, Dr. John Baugh, who is one of my linguistic heroes. The title of my talk today is Talking Black, Sounding Black, Middle Class African American English, and the State of the Black Union. And as Dr. Baugh said, this talk is drawn from my new book on Middle Class African American English, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2021. Those who are familiar with the extensive body of research on African American English will undoubtedly know that the bulk of the research thus far has focused on working class varieties, while the use of African American English by middle class speakers has remained relatively underexamined, despite calls as early as 1983 by Orlando Taylor, among others, to rethink and refine our approach. As observed by Taylor, this gap in the sociolinguistic literature has been guided by a tendency for researchers to define African American English in terms of a fairly narrow set of vernacular features, coupled by the assumption that such features are used primarily, if not exclusively, by working class speakers. As a result, we know little about the ways in which many middle class African American speakers also draw on the African American linguistic continuum, including the use of vernacular features once thought to have been avoided by speakers higher on the socioeconomic spectrum. And we've largely ignored the more standard end of the African American continuum, where vernacular features often get minimized, but racial and ethnic identities get performed through the strategic use of more nuanced linguistic features. The goal of my book project was to explore the important role that African American English plays in the construction of racial and ethnic identity among middle class speakers for whom the intersections of race and class often lead to conflicting norms and expectations, and to consider the kinds of nuanced perceptions that serve to motivate such linguistic usages. I'd like to start today, however, by sharing a bit of a personal perspective on this topic. So I was born in the 1960s in Columbia, South Carolina, a southern mid-sized town located in the central part of the state. My parents, who both grew up on small farms in rural South Carolina, raised my sister and me in an all-black, lower middle-class suburban neighborhood where we attended a public school system that was almost entirely black due to de facto segregation. Like other Black middle-class families, we participated in activities that reflected a certain level of social capital in the African-American community. We attended an all-Black church, whose membership included many community leaders, educators, and professionals. My father was a member of the local Townsmen's Club, which was a social civic organization for African-American men in the community. My mother played cards with the Bridge Club, comprised of all African-American women, many of whom were educators. As teenagers, my sister and I were presented as debutantes in a local cotillion that accepted participants by invitation only and was largely restricted to elite Black families in the area. While these and other such activities were largely reflective of Black professional life and to some extent the privileges and practices of the Black elite, our network of family and friends from the perspectives of both race and class was broad and diverse. Thus, whether I was getting my hair done at the local beauty salon, playing with other kids in the neighborhood, working on choreography at the Governor's School for the Arts, or performing in the church handbell choir, I became adept at blending into my environment both socially and linguistically. My circle of friends was primarily comprised of school-oriented, college-bound kids for whom standard English was both expected and accepted, at least in certain contexts. Standard language ideology was reinforced both at school and at home. I was corrected for certain grammatical errors by my teachers, parents, and other family members, many of whom were educated themselves. And yet, there was always an unspoken and sometimes spoken stigma associated with what was called sounding proper or talking white. And erring too far in that direction could result in being labeled an Oreo. After graduating from high school, I attended a private, predominantly white, politically conservative university in the South, whose undergraduate student population numbered less than 3,000, and whose total Black student population never exceeded 100 students in the time that I attended. I was able to attend this elite university, which was priced well out of reach for most middle-income families, including my own, thanks to a full academic scholarship that was achievement-based, but also likely tied to some affirmative action initiatives. Despite my exposure to diverse groups of people while growing up, this was a difficult transition for me socially, as I was pulled out of my predominantly Black environment and thrust into a world of privilege and to some extent prejudice, for which I was largely unfamiliar. As a coping mechanism that was as much about guarding myself against prejudice as it was about seeking familiarity and solidarity, I actively befriended other African American students on campus. I sat at the Black table in the cafeteria, sang on the all-Black gospel choir, was co-captain of the predominantly Black dance team, and participated in the Student League for Black Culture, thus ensuring a significant amount of interaction and engagement with the other African American students who were enrolled at the university at the time. Despite these intentional acts of aligning myself with the African American community in college, I had frequent and regular interactions with white students as well. Given the small percentage of African American students enrolled in the school, I was typically the only African American student or one of only 2 or 3 in most of my classes. And there were often incidents relating to language and race that defined these interactions. I recall once having a conversation with a white classmate who mentioned to me that he was from Alabama. When I responded that he didn't sound particularly Southern to me, he took offense, and to my surprise, said that I did not sound particularly Black to him. I too took offense, but it was difficult at the time to pinpoint what offended me most. The implication that I should sound a certain way because I was Black, or the suggestion that I was somehow less Black because I did not fit the stereotype. In retrospect, I wonder if he felt similarly conflicted about my assessment of his speech. Invoking William Labove's 1972 concept of the linguistic lane to describe speakers who are presumed to be unfamiliar with the norms of vernacular street culture, John Baugh shared a similar struggle growing up in an environment where mixed messages about language ultimately led to what he called a sociolinguistic paradox. And I quote him here, "I didn't want to sound lame, and I had observed in the corner most of the cool brothers could talk the talk, and those who exhibited urban eloquence never did so in standard English. What then was I to do? Should I use standard English to the exclusion of African American speech norms and risk ridicule or social rejection from my Black peers? Or should I resist my parents' standard English advocacy and suffer the domestic consequences of open linguistic rebellion at home? This paradox might be said to reflect what W.E.B. Du Bois described as early as 1903 as the double consciousness experienced by many Americans of African descent, that, quote, sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, to souls, to thoughts, to unreconciled strivings. It also relates to the concept of linguistic push-pull, a term coined by Geneva Smitherman in the 1970s to describe, quote, Black folk loving, embracing, using Black talk while simultaneously rejecting and hating on it. While the term African American English remains relatively unfamiliar outside linguistic circles, metalinguistic commentary regarding talking Black or sounding Black is both pervasive and longstanding. From a mainstream perspective, these terms are often used to connote a lack of education or sophistication, and can even be linked to notions of minstrelsy and other types of negative racial stereotyping, as referenced to by Shucking and Jiving in this internet meme. And yet there remains a keen sense of the importance of talking and sounding Black and constructing an African American identity and establishing solidarity within the African American community. By contrast, talking white or sounding white, also known as talking or sounding proper, tends to connote a certain level of education and correctness. And yet, as alluded to in this video, many who are perceived as talking or sounding white find themselves being shunned or ostracized by other members of the African American community.
All right, hear me out. I just had to say, I saw this on a post on Facebook, and I wanted to talk about it on video. There's no such thing as talking white, or, you know, you're speaking white. It's actually called speaking fluently, speaking your language correctly. I don't know why we've gotten to a place where, as a culture, as a race, if you sound as though you have more than a 5th grade education, it's a bad thing. You know, there's actually nothing wrong with that. In other cultures, if you speak your language correctly and fluently, it's actually admired. Wow, this woman's educated, this man is educated, where did you go to school? You know, this person took the time and had the drive to get it right, to speak correctly. I find that our culture is one of the few that actually frowns upon personal evolvement. So I just ask that you think about that. I know it's something we don't like to talk about, but having proper diction doesn't belong to the Caucasian race. That really gets under my skin. Having proper diction is what you're supposed to do. And I have to say, if you only speak one language, I can understand if you're bilingual, that's different. But if you only speak one language, even like your native tongue, and you don't speak it correctly, that's not cool. If you don't know how to, you know, enunciate your words, like, that's not cool. It shouldn't be frowned upon. So let's stop saying that. You know, this person talks white, acts white. Think about what you're saying. Because, you know, in the same conversation, you'll say the white man's bringing us down, but you don't realize that you're actually elevating this race by saying they're the only ones that are allowed to speak as though they are educated. And that's not right. Think about it.
So for John Baugh, as for me, the solution to this sociolinguistic paradox was to become a linguistic chameleon, alternating between more vernacular and more mainstream ways of speaking depending on the context, often referred to in the linguistic literature as code switching or style shifting. Comedians Key and Peele offer a more lighthearted take on this paradox in their depiction of themselves as white-sounding Black guys. So in this talk, I consider some of the linguistic underpinnings of what it means to talk or sound Black among middle-class African Americans for whom such competing linguistic norms and paradoxical tensions are often encountered at the intersections of racial and socioeconomic continua. And I consider the ways in which African American English is strategically used by middle-class African American speakers to construct both race-based and class-based identities that signal affinity with the African American speech community while still acknowledging mainstream norms and expectations. I began with a focus on the linguistic performances of a group of panelists featured in Tavis Smiley's State of the Black Union Symposium, an annual event that aired on C-SPAN from 2000 to 2009. The linguistic agility and oratorical talents of African American public figures have long been celebrated and imitated by the public at large, and yet such figures have been largely excluded from prevailing sociolinguistic definitions of the African American speech community. Furthermore, the celebration of Black oratorical talent often stands in stark contrast to the prevailing public stigma associated with vernacular language usage. A growing number of studies have begun to explore the performative styles of African American celebrities, political activists, religious leaders, and scholars, many of whom draw extensively on the African American rhetorical tradition in order to signal solidarity with the African American community. However, there's been little acknowledgement of the paradoxical tension that exists between the widespread stigma of AAVE and the widespread appeal of the African American rhetorical tradition. I argue here that understanding more about the ways in which many prominent African American public figures incorporate vernacular features into their public presentations, as well as the extent to which certain distinctive aspects of the African American repertoire both draw upon and extend beyond the vernacular, that understanding this can help to elucidate this paradox. The State of the Black Union Symposium, which was hosted by Tavis Smiley, featured panels of nationally recognized public figures and drew primarily Black audiences in the range of 7,000 to 10,000 participants each year, but with a television viewing audience that was likely more racially mixed. It was this event that first piqued my interest in the study of middle-class African American English, as I observed the panelists strategically draw on vernacular feature usage and Black rhetorical style in their public presentation. The data that I analyzed were drawn from the 2004 panel, which focused on the theme of strengthening the Black family. Smiley, as the moderator, was joined by 6 female panelists: Marva Collins, Merle Evers-Williams, Julia Hare, Sheila Jackson-Lee, Vashti McKenzie, and Susan Taylor, and 6 male panelists: Naeem Akbar, Jordan Harris, Jeffrey Johnson, Greg Mathis, David Satcher, and Cornell West. A quick comparison across the inventories of grammatical, phonological, and lexical and rhetorical features observed in the data shows that the panelists overall depended much more heavily on phonological, lexical, and rhetorical features than they did on grammatical features in their public presentations. Furthermore, the male panelists routinely used more phonological and grammatical features in their presentations than did their female counterparts. By contrast, slang and other lexical items were more pervasive among the panelists, though they consisted mostly of common, long-standing terms like auntie and hood, or expressions like keeping it real or calling someone out of their name, terms that have crossed generational boundaries within the Black community, and in some instances have crossed racial boundaries as well over time due to mainstream appropriation. Even more common, however, was the strategic use of discursive and rhetorical techniques, including metalinguistic commentary, preaching register, signifying, and reading, which were used by the panelists to signal familiarity with and affinity to the African American speech community. I'll place some examples here. The first is metalinguistic commentary. Tavis Smiley.
Why is it so dope for those who are watching the channel to watch us on C-SPAN? Why is it hip? Why is it cool? Why is it okay to be felt
Preaching Register by Sheila Jackson Lee. Signifying by Julia Hare. And Reading by Greg Mathis. As the moderator of the event, Tavis Smiley in particular drew variably on the vernacular to do things like mitigate face-threatening acts, speak candidly or forcefully, boast about the panelists' accomplishments, and build solidarity with the audience. In this excerpt, which was drawn from the close of the event, Smiley used phonological features such as I monophthongization and postvocalic R-lessness, accompanied by occasional performative shifts into vernacular grammatical feature usage, such as the use of multiple negation, and framed in a call-response pattern that is characteristic of Black rhetorical style, particularly in Black church settings such as the megachurch where this event was held. The range of linguistic behaviors exhibited by the State of the Black Union participants demonstrates how African Americans at higher levels of the socioeconomic spectrum often draw on the vernacular strategically while simultaneously demonstrating their familiarity with more mainstream norms of usage in ways that allow them to reap the benefits of both in-group and out-group membership. Key to accomplishing the task of talking or sounding Black while appealing to the expectations of the mainstream establishment was the strategic use of vernacular features, particularly at the level of phonology, as well as the lexical and rhetorical features that are salient in terms of both their racial and ethnic marking, but not highly stigmatized from a mainstream perspective. By contrast, saliently marked features such as ain't or the pronunciation of ask as acts were typically reserved for more stylized performances in which the intentionality of the vernacular usage was made evident. So up to this point, I've been using the terms talking Black and sounding Black more or less interchangeably, as they are often used in the community itself. There is some evidence, however, that the phonological and prosodic cues associated with sounding Black are perhaps more critical to listeners' assessments of African American voices than grammatical feature usage and even the lexical and rhetorical features that were so prominently displayed in the State of the Black Union panelists' performances. In the 2017 documentary, Talking Black in America, Sonja Lanehart describes the ways in which prosodic information informs our perceptions of racial identity and affiliation. And I quote here, "When I talk to people and I ask them about that, ask them about what Blackness is, what Black language is to them, what does sounding Black mean to them, more often than not, it's about a sound and a rhythm, this sort of movement and fluidity." The following exchange, drawn from the opening of Talking Black in America, is illustrative of Lanehart's observation. Exchange between two Atlanta-based musicians, Brandon defends his accent because I choose to pronounce my words, I'm not talking Black, while also defending his identity as a member of the African American community. I'm totally Black. I'm Black. Notable in this exchange is his repeated pronunciation of talking with an angma rather than an N, his pronunciation of defines and I'm with a full diphthong rather than a monophthong, and his pronunciation of your with R constriction rather than deletion or vocalization. Because the variables ing, I, and R often function as shibboleths in the African American speech community, with the vernacular variants signaling racial affinity and community membership, Brandon's use of the more formal variants here serves to reinforce Slayer's retort. Yeah, but you're not talking Black because you don't sound Black while you're talking. Among middle-class speakers, the concept of sounding Black becomes a particularly important element in the construction of African American identity because it is at the level of prosody and phonology that speakers are often able to align themselves with the African American speech community without running the risk of being perceived as uneducated or lower status, assessments that are often triggered by the use of vernacular grammatical features. Studies such as Baugh 1996 and Purnell et al. 1999 and others have shown that listeners are able to accurately identify the racial and/or ethnic background of speakers with only minimal acoustic and/or phonological cues. Beyond racial and ethnic identification, however, the concept of sounding Black also speaks to perceptions of racial and ethnic identity. Within the African American speech community, there are many circulating labels that allude to the more nuanced distinctions that listeners make in their perceptions of African American voices. In South Carolina, for example, labels such as country to refer to someone who is Southern, rural, and lacking in class or sophistication, ghetto to refer to someone who is more urban but lacking in class or sophistication, Geechee to describe an Africanized identity tied to the South Carolina Low Country, and proper to refer to people who are seen as talking, sounding, or acting white, speak to the diversity of African American voices and identities that are salient and in some cases even marked among listeners. From a linguistic perspective, however, little research has gone into exploring how listeners assign such labels to speakers' voices and what social characteristics get indexed through those assignments. College campuses provide an interesting context for examining these dynamics, given the linguistic tightrope that many college-educated African Americans find themselves having to navigate. Because sounding Black plays such an important role in the construction of African American identity, but is often perceived as being incompatible with sounding educated, many African American college students, and indeed many middle-class African Americans more generally, tend to develop a heightened awareness of the costs and rewards of their linguistic choices and practices, thus hearkening back to Geneva Smitherman's concept of linguistic push-pull described earlier. In a study of the reactions and attitudes of African American college students, staff, and administrators at a predominantly white institution in California, Jacqueline Rahman found that the use of Black Standard English, also referred to variably in the literature as Standard Black English, African American Standard English, and Standard African American English, and defined as standard grammatical usage combined with ethnically marked phonological and prosodic features, was deemed by many African Americans to be the best way to meet establishment requirements while also allowing speakers to express their racial and ethnic identity. However, listener perceptions of African American voices are likely to vary to some extent depending on the regional context and racial composition of the school population. And the South adds yet another layer of complexity to these issues because of the marked and often stigmatized nature of both Southern and African American language varieties in the U.S. So for the second half of this talk, I'll share the results of an online perception study that I conducted that examined these issues in the context of college campuses situated in the American South. The results of the study provide a glimpse into the more nuanced distinctions that college students, who arguably represent a younger middle-class demographic, make across various African American voices. And I'll consider some of the costs and rewards associated with certain African American identities as they are indexed by these voices. The simile for the study were drawn from 6 recorded speakers, 1 female and 1 male, representing each of 3 varieties. Proper, describing those who, quote unquote, don't sound Black. Standard African American English, a term that doesn't circulate within the community and, to be honest, hasn't been given much attention within linguistic circles either, but describes voices that are ethnically marked but without overtly stigmatized phonological and grammatical feature usage. And Gullah, to refer to the regionalized and often stigmatized variety tied to an Africanized identity and spoken in South Carolina and Georgia. So these 6 speakers were chosen based on the quality of their recordings, the distinctiveness of their voices vis-a-vis others of the same sex, and the extent to which their voices seemed exemplary of the varieties in question. With the exception of the proper male, who identified as Black, white, biracial, all of the speakers identified as African American. The proper female was a native of Columbia, South Carolina, who moved around as a military dependent. All of the other speakers were born and raised in South Carolina, with the exception of the proper male, who was born in Pasadena, California, but raised in Greenville, South Carolina. To solicit participation for this study, I emailed faculty members and student leaders at several colleges and universities in South Carolina and Georgia and asked them to help distribute the survey link to students at their respective schools. I restricted the solicitation to these 2 states in an effort to increase the likelihood of listeners having at least some familiarity with Gullah. The anonymous survey was designed to take approximately 10 to 15 minutes to complete and was conducted online. Participants were informed at the outset that the focus of the study was on the labeling and perception of African American voices and the concept of sounding Black. To get a sense of the participants' perceptions of their own linguistic backgrounds, I asked them to select among a list of options which of the given varieties they spoke, if any, and they were asked to select all that applied. Given the focus of the study on sounding Black, the list of options that I provided the participants heavily favored African American language varieties, such as African American English, Ebonics, Gullah, and Geechee. Other labels provided were either specific to the South, such as Southern American English, or labels that described varieties that were distributed across regional and ethnic boundaries in the U.S., such as mainstream American English and Standard American English. Among the African American participants, African American English was the most popular response, selected at 67%, followed by Standard American English, which was selected by 63% of African American participants. The most popular variety selected among European American respondents was Standard American English, followed by Southern American English. No other variety was selected by more than 50% of either participant group. It's perhaps noteworthy here that Ebonics, which is arguably a much more familiar term than African American English, for most members of the general public was only selected by 19% of participants, perhaps because of the more negative connotations associated with the term since the Oakland School Board controversy in the late 1990s. Participants were also asked to choose among a list of options which, if any, of the given labels they would use to describe their own speech and which of the given labels others had used to describe their speech. Again, they were instructed to select all that applied. As you'll see, these are the same labels that were ultimately used in the perception study itself for the participants to rate the voices that they heard. Perhaps not surprisingly, given the focus of the study on college-educated students, the most popular label for both groups was proper. The only other label selected by at least 50% of participants was country. So in order to create the stimuli for the perception study, I asked each speaker to read several word lists and reading passages. Grammatical variables and other linguistic phenomena were controlled for through the use of these texts, thus facilitating comparison across speakers. For the purposes of the perception study, I presented listeners with 3 different stimuli for each speaker: the greeting hello, the act of sucking teeth, followed by the expression whatever, and the first stanza of Mary Had a Little Lamb. For the first 2 stimuli, participants were asked to rate the voices on the 4 circulating labels, country, ghetto, geechee, and proper. Based on the observed patterns of usage, I predicted that the Gullah voices would be rated highest on geechee, while the proper voices would be rated highest on proper. In the absence of any circulating labels for standard African American English, I had less clear expectations about how listeners might perceive and label these voices, though I expected them to pattern closer to proper than to Gullah. For the third stimulus, Mary Had a Little Lamb, participants were asked to rate the voices on a variety of social characteristics such as friendliness, sexiness, and nerdiness, and I'll get to those results momentarily, but I start here with hello. Using the greeting hello as a stimulus to test listener perceptions, Purnell et al. 1999 found that listeners were able to accurately assess the race and ethnicity of speakers using only this minimal cue. I presented hello as the first stimulus in this study to determine whether listeners could make more nuanced distinctions, in this case across a variety of African American voices using the same minimal stimulus. Unlike Purnell et al., however, who employed a true matched guise technique by which a single speaker represented multiple guises, I presented listeners with stimuli from multiple speakers in order to create a more naturalistic, though less controlled listening experience. For each of the circulating labels, participants were asked to rate the voices on a scale of 1 to 5, where a rating of 1 meant that the voice did not exemplify the given label at all, a rating of 3 meant that the voice kind of exemplified the given label, and a rating of 5 meant that the voice really exemplified the given label. Any rating above 3, which I've shaded in dark gray in the tables, was interpreted as a positive rating, meaning that the participants associated the voice with the given label. So I'll play the hello stimuli here. Around. I hope you were able to figure out which was which there. I should have I don't know why it bounced around in order there. Predictably here, the Gullah female was rated highest for geechee, and the proper and standard speakers were rated highest for proper by both African American and European American participants. Surprising here, though, were the ratings for the Gullah male speaker, who didn't rate above 3 for any of the labels among the African American respondents, and was rated highest for ghetto among European American respondents. A comparison of the estimated marginal means shows that Gullah voices were rated as significantly higher on both geechee and ghetto compared to proper and standard voices, which were rated significantly higher on proper. And so I've represented this oppositional effect by the circles on the slide. The second stimulus that participants heard was that of each speaker sucking their teeth, followed by the expression whatever, an expression that's typically used by speakers to signal dismissiveness or a lack of concern for something or someone. I presented this as the second stimulus in the study in order to determine whether a brief verbal cue that was racially marked and more semantically loaded would yield a different set of ratings than those observed for the more semantically neutral hello. Unlike hello, the act of sucking teeth is a racially marked gesture used in the African American speech community to signal disgust or disapproval. Before recording the stimulus, I asked each speaker if they understood what was meant by the expression sucking teeth. Each one answered affirmatively and then proceeded to demonstrate the gesture correctly, with the exception of the proper male, who said that he was familiar with the gesture, but then demonstrated something more akin to cleaning his teeth. The waveform images shown here illustrate how his production of sucking teeth differed in both length and amplitude from those of the other speakers. Because I wanted to capture the speaker's natural tendencies for producing the given stimuli, I did not correct his interpretation of sucking teeth, but instead used it for the perception study as he produced it. So for this stimulus, let me play the samples first. So that's the standard male. And that's the proper male. And that's the gullah male. Proper female. Standard female. Gullah female. I think it actually is representing the order that they were presented in the study. I see that. That's very nice. Someone did that for me. Thank you. So for this stimulus, the proper female continued to rate highest on proper, and the proper male rated highest on proper among African American respondents, but didn't register over 3 at all among the European American respondents. Among the Gullah and standard African American English speakers, however, this stimulus actually triggered ghetto for all but the standard African American English female speaker, who didn't receive a rating over 3 for any of the labels. And the Gullah female also received ratings over 3 on country among African American respondents. Several factors might have contributed to the shift in ratings here. To the extent that sucking teeth is regarded as a racially marked and dismissive gesture, it may be that it indexes a certain type of stereotypical blackness, the trope of the angry black male or female. So this act alone might have prompted the higher ghetto rating shown in the table. Secondly, given the strong association with post-vocalic R-lessness with both urban and rural working class speech, the R-less pronunciation of whatever might have prompted both the country and ghetto ratings that were activated for the second stimulus. As shown here, a comparison of the F3 values points to a continuum of rhoticity ranging from the non-rhotic production of Gullah speakers to the more intermediate but impressionistically rhotic production of the standard African American English speakers to the acutely rhotic production of the proper speakers whose F3 values were more dramatically lowered. When the means are examined for the second stimulus, you see a more defined 3-part hierarchy in comparison to the first stimulus, where standard and proper stood more or less in opposition to Gullah. Here we see a distinctive Gullah, standard African American English, proper hierarchy for both Geechee and ghetto, and the reverse, a proper standard African American English, Gullah hierarchy for proper, again as circled on the figure. The final utterance that participants heard was the first stanza of Mary Had a Little Lamb, a prompt that was also used by John Baugh in his research on linguistic profiling. For this stimulus, listeners were asked to rate the voices that they heard on 9 social characteristics distributed over 4 dimensions as shown in the table. These characteristics were chosen based on my own observations about the kind of commentary that the voices in question tend to invoke.
Mary had a little lamb. Its fleece was white and everywhere that Mary went, the lamb was sure to go.
It's a proper female.
Mary.
The Gullah male. The standard female. Standard male. That's the Gullah female. And that was the proper male. So the only solidarity characteristic that received ratings over 3 was friendly. The association of the standard African American English and proper voices with friendliness might be seen as somewhat surprising given findings reported in other matched guy studies that high status voices tend to be rated low on solidarity. However, these results were similar to those reported in studies such as Buck 1968 and Tucker and Lambert 1975, where college students rated standard voices favorably not only on the status dimensions, but also on solidarity dimensions. So the friendliness results in this study might be tied, at least in part, to the observation made earlier about participants perceiving their own voices as standard or proper, and perhaps viewing the standard and proper voices favorably because they found them to be relatable to their own. On the status dimension, African American respondents rated all of the voices above 3 for sounding educated, and European American respondents rated all of the voices above 3 on this characteristic, except that of the Gullah female. The only voice rated above 3 for nerdy was that of the proper male, who received high ratings for this characteristic by both African American and European American participants. With regard to gender and sexuality, there were no particular surprises in that the female speakers were rated above 3 on femininity and the male speakers were rated above 3 on masculinity. However, none of the speakers were rated above 3 on sexiness by either African American or European American respondents. Admittedly, the nature of the stimulus likely played a role in these results, as a children's poem does not lend itself readily to demonstrations of sexiness. Finally, both African American and European American participants rated the Gullah and standard African American English voices above 3 for having a strong Black identity, while the proper voices received low ratings on this characteristic. Going back to the solidarity dimension, a look at the mean rating shows that both Gullah and standard African American English voices pattern significantly higher than proper on coolness, with the reverse image on snootiness, where proper voices were significantly higher. On the status dimension, the mean ratings point to a clear, proper, standard Gullah hierarchy for educated. By contrast, for nerdy, the proper voice is rated significantly higher than Gullah and standard African American English, but there was no significant difference between Gullah and SAAE. So SAAE again appears to find an intermediate niche where it is perceived as more educated than Gullah, but less nerdy than proper. On the gender and sexuality dimension, while the male and female voices pattern as might be expected for masculinity and femininity, as noted earlier, it's perhaps worth noting that listeners rated the proper voices as more feminine overall than the Gullah and standard African American English voices, which were rated as sounding more masculine than the proper voices. And finally, with regard to racial identity, we again observed a Gullah standard proper hierarchy, but pointing here to a clear association of both Gullah and standard African American English voices with a strong Black identity. So to summarize, the results of this perception study showed that sounding Black is a rich and complex phenomenon, and that listeners are attuned to the nuanced differences and well-equipped to assess them. Viewed from a cost-reward perspective, voices perceived as having a strong Black identity, in this case Gullah and standard African American English, appeared to pattern with notions of coolness and a general lack of nerdiness or snootiness, but they appear to do so at some cost, particularly in the context of more ethnically loaded expressions, which in the case of the Gullah speakers seemed to lend themselves more readily to perceptions of sounding ghetto and to some extent country. At the other end of the spectrum, proper voices were closely associated with sounding educated, but such associations appeared to come at the expense of sounding like they have a strong Black identity, and are instead associated with perceptions of nerdiness, snootiness, and a lack of coolness. Relative to these more extreme associations indexed by gullah and proper voices, the standard African American English voices appeared to represent somewhat of a happy medium. In instances where distinct hierarchies emerge, for example, in perceptions of sounding ghetto or proper, they managed to fill the intermediate spaces between the two extremes. And yet they trended closer to gullah and being perceived as sounding more cool, but not snooty or nerdy. And they trended closer to proper and being perceived as sounding educated. So standard African American English actually seems to serve an essential function for many middle-class African Americans who wish to carve out both class-based and race-based identities for themselves through the strategic manipulation of linguistic features that minimize stigma while maximizing perceptions of in-group affiliation and racial or ethnic marking. Drawing inspiration from a language levels grid created by Mary Rhodes Hoover in 1978, I illustrate here the ways in which standard African American English seems to accomplish this task. Performative contexts like the State of the Black Union aside, non-standard grammatical features which are high in salience and stigma tend to mark speakers as less educated or of a lower socioeconomic status. Thus, regardless of race, a key element in the construction of middle-class identity in the United States seems to be the avoidance of non-standard grammatical constructions, an observation also made by Wolfram and Shelley Nestes in 1998. And given the high racial ethnic marking associated with many non-standard grammatical forms, the avoidance of non-standard grammatical features is perhaps even more important for African American speakers trying to construct middle-class identities for themselves. Thus, in order to construct race-based identities that do not compete with their class-based identities, many middle-class African American speakers turn to racially, ethnically marked phonological and prosodic features, some of which may be perceived by mainstream listeners as carrying moderate levels of stigma, but which are balanced by their capacity to leverage community perceptions of sounding Black. Similarly, the use of racially or ethnically marked lexical, rhetorical, and discourse features, which tend to be more salient to casual observers, contribute to community perceptions of talking Black, but often incur lower levels of overt stigma and, in fact, often get perceived positively by mainstream listeners. Though not discussed in today's presentation, camouflage features, such as remote stressed Ben, seem to carry less salience and stigma because they get used below the level of conscious awareness, though little is known about how such features get perceived along the standardness continuum and whether such perceptions differ across racial lines. However, to the extent that the racial ethnic distinctiveness of these features gets noticed by listeners, they may also contribute to perceptions of talking Black. For me, standard African American English is the voice through which I have largely constructed my own Black academic identity, and yet it is not without its challenges. Rather, I found that it elicits different responses from different audiences. From the perspective of more vernacular speaking African Americans, my use of standard African American English has been perceived as sounding white or proper, while for my predominantly white and primarily standard speaking academic colleagues, I'm often perceived as mostly standard, but not fully assimilated. I have a particularly vivid memory as a young faculty member of attending a linguistics conference where I had volunteered to read a colleague's paper for a plenary that she was unable to attend. After the event, a colleague from the audience noted with surprise how pronounced my pen merger was, even though she knew that I was from the South. Another approached me to ask how I would describe my speech. And when I responded that I had assumed it was some version of standard English, she paused with deep reflection before walking off. I too stood there in deep reflection, wondering if anyone had actually heard the content of my colleague's paper that evening, or if it was instead my language that had inadvertently become the focus of the keynote address. While these observations could have been as much about my Southern background as they were about my racialized identity, they seemed to run counter to my college classmates' observation, which I shared earlier, that I didn't sound Black. In fact, these seemingly conflicting assessments of my speech are characteristic of the linguistic no man's land that standard African American English can occupy. And indeed, while I have made some effort, particularly in my professional life, to adjust certain aspects of my voice accordingly, attempting to pronounce my words like pen with an epsilon, trying to round out the diphthong in words like male, or even altering the pitch and intonation of my voice in certain contexts, I have found that such adjustments have been challenging, both in terms of the level of awareness and control that I have over these aspects of my voice, as well as my lack of motivation to fully assimilate to white middle-class norms. My goal, after all, is not to sound white, but to be accepted in my professional sphere as an educated speaker and writer. In conclusion, what I hope to have demonstrated through this talk is that the study of middle-class African American English has much to offer to our understanding of the breadth and diversity of the African American language continuum, as well as the African American speech community. Far from being the linguistic lames that they have been described as, many middle-class African American speakers do, in fact, draw upon the African American linguistic continuum to construct their racial identities and signal affinity with the African American community. As linguists, we should correct the erasures of the past by giving visibility and credence to their experiences and to their contributions to the strength and vitality of the African American speech community. Thank you. I don't know how questions work, but I'm happy to take them. Is there a way to see questions online? Will someone feed them to me? Yes. Okay. I think we're still processing. Maybe I've answered all the questions. That would be great. Sure.
So, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. So, looking big picture at the study of African Americans within the social sciences, linguistics is somewhat unique in the sense that the study of African Americans was actually central to the development of quantitative sociolinguistics. In sociology, anthropology, political science, the study of African Americans is often marginalized. And within the study of African Americans, which is robust in sociolinguistics, your work really is unique with respect to the inclusion of vernacular middle-class African American style shifting. And I know that Mary Hoover and Orlando Taylor had a lot to do with emphasizing the importance of that. But could you share a little bit about how it is that you were able to develop research strategies that let us get at authentic varieties of that? And the reason that I'm formulating the question in that way is you have been able to overcome the experimenter effect that I couldn't overcome, right? And so there's a very unique quality to how you've approached this topic, even though some of us have tried and failed.
Thank you for that. I'm not sure that I've completely overcome it. Whenever we observe language in process, there is some effect to the observation, presumably on the behavior. But as I said in the talk, I was first inspired to do this work looking at the State of Black Union, which was a performance that was not specifically focused on language, but presented many opportunities to observe language in its natural setting. And so that's sort of where I started. And I do think there are lots of opportunities for more of that kind of observation that will provide glimpses into the ways in which middle-class African-American speakers behave. There's also a nod in the end of my book to the representation of middle-class African-American speakers in film and television, where I think, the representations also tell us something about sort of the ways in which language is used and assessed. And so I think there are opportunities there as well. But for me, the self-study, which I didn't really share here, but is in my book and I've shared it in other places, was an opportunity both for self-reflection, but also a way of sort of looking inside the homes of African-American families, something that I would not have been able to do most likely with anyone else. And so it was a difficult thing to do, to be able to open up myself in that way. But I learned a lot about myself, and I hope that being that forthcoming has been informative, I think, for the linguistic community as well. And I would encourage other African-American linguists in particular who are open to doing that type of work to consider ways to sort of build on that. I think it also helps, and I'm sure that you experience this as well, that being a member of the community helps to make other speakers more comfortable. And so there are ways in which I think we are able to do that work within the communities where there isn't as much masking going on as there might be with other researchers. So I took multiple approaches. And I'm sure that, there is still much that I haven't tapped into, but I believe it's a good start.
Okay. Thank you for a really stimulating and wonderful talk. And I just wanted to add to something that you just mentioned, which is that I've noticed lately that voiceovers on some commercials are being done by people who speak that standard African American English dialect. Yes. And I think it's very interesting because if it was too ghetto or whatever, then it might alienate whites. But yes, since it's clearly African American but standard, it appeals to both sides. Yes. And, they obviously that's for money because they want to reach the widest market they can. But I've heard people like Jessica Williams, I think, doing some of those voiceovers. And she is, exemplifies, I think, that dialect.
Yes. I haven't paid much attention to the voiceover, so that's something that I'll have to look at myself. But I do think that to the extent that marketing is a consideration, that's probably also an area that is ripe for growth. There's something to be said for sort of taking the positive valences associated with African American language and identity and minimizing the negative that can be quite marketable. So that's I would imagine something that we should be paying close attention to. Okay. There's one more hand.
Hi, thank you so much for that talk. I actually read your book earlier this year, so I was very excited to hear you talk in person.
Thank you.
I am also a budding scholar for African American English, and I primarily look at how it intersects in the educational sphere. Okay. And I know that a lot of the work that's been looking at dialect use within classrooms has primarily focused more on that working class variety of African American English. And something that I've been really kind of tussling with is where does the middle class African American English speaking child kind of fit into how we view AAE in the educational sphere. And I was wondering if you could give me some of your thoughts or implications and how those group of kids kind of fit into the larger debate of AAE in education.
That's a great question. I think the focus on working class varieties in the early days of research on African American English, Mary Buckles talks about it in terms of strategic essentialism. It was this focus on those who are most in need of intervention and assistance, educating teachers about what working class vernacular speaking African American students were actually using in the classroom, and using it in some instances as a bridge to sort of academic English varieties. But I do think that there is value in also acknowledging some of the sociolinguistic paradox that I talked about today that many middle class students often feel, and this pressure to sort of mask, an aspect of their identities that is very much critical to who they see themselves as. I think it's also beneficial for educators to see African American English as not just that vernacular end of the continuum, but the full spectrum. So I do think that there are ways in which middle class African American English can contribute to how we approach African American English within classroom settings in that way. I think there's one more question here, and then we'll go to online. Is that okay?
Thank you for a wonderful talk. You already know that I'm a big fan of your work. And I'd like to announce to the audience here, excuse me if I do this, but Tracy is going to be the keynote at the Lexical conference being held at LSU in the spring. So those of you who have research on inclusion, we welcome it. Please send us the abstract. Now, my question.
Thank you for that.
Yes. I had to make this announcement because we're going to have her. So
it's my year for overexposure, but I've tried to sort of pull from different parts of the book. And then at the LSU talk, the CCAL talk at LSU, I'll actually focus exclusively on my self-study. So if you're interested in hearing more about that, that's what I'll focus on there.
Yes, exactly. So please stay tuned. It's a virtual conference, so don't worry about traveling or getting infected. So my question follows up on the young lady's question, and is, how do you, as a mother and an educator, deal with language, specifically with young African Americans who are parents themselves and may want to ask you what's the best way for children to express themselves? Do they want to be African American? Do they want to be mainstream? And how would you approach such a question from a parent or your own students?
Yeah, that's a great question. I focus on my family in the self-study, and so my children are included in that, and they were fairly young. They were not even teenagers. They're teenagers now, so they weren't teenagers when I did the recordings. They are actually, I think, just now coming into their own sort of linguistic identities, understanding sort of what language means and some of these, more nuanced distinctions that I've talked about. And I struggle, as a mother as well as an educator, to both embrace and celebrate their language, however it presents itself, but to also be very realistic about how the world will take them in. And I'm honest about that in the classroom. When I teach an undergraduate course on African American English, where we sort of talk about the systematicity and rule governedness of vernacular varieties, what that means, and the ways in which these sort of assessments and the stigma are not based in any type of linguistic fact, that this is really just about, socialization. And yet, I have to explain to them that when they go to their English classes or their history classes or their science and math classes, there will be the expectation that they will use standard mainstream English. That's a hard message, right? Because it really is, it's that mixed message again. But I think just having the conversation, starting from a place of truth about what is really being assessed, and that it's not about language is a good start. And I imagine that generations that are coming will probably feel less pressure perhaps than even my generation or my parents' generation to necessarily adhere to what is sometimes referred to as the respectability politics of language. So I think as linguists, who are in a position to be able to sort of talk about the linguistic facts, we are equipping those younger generations with the tools that they might need to sort of make the rules for themselves, if that makes sense. Thank you.
So I'm going to ask some questions from the chat.
Okay.
So Lisa Green, these are two questions, actually, they're somewhat
Hi,
related
Lisa.
and pick up on some of what we've already heard here in the in-person. Lisa Green says, Dr. Weldon, can you discuss SAAE and acquisition? And Sanja Lanehart chimes in the chat with, what I find interesting about AASE/SAAE is that I grew up in a working class community till I was 12 years old, so I didn't have a connection to AASE/SAAE in my community. I'm now middle class, so with respect to Lisa, I am interested in when we can even talk about the acquisition of AASE/SAAE.
Yeah, so I haven't looked at standard African American English from an acquisition point of view. Arthur Spears has a great chapter in Sanja Lanehart's edited African American English handbook that focuses specifically on African American Standard English. And he makes a distinction that I don't use, but I do think it's something we need to pay attention to between standard African American English and African American Standard English, the latter of which I believe, if I'm not mistaken, he argues is a dying variety. He says that it was something that was born out of a particular point in time when there were middle-class African American communities that were sort of insulated, and there were these expectations to sort of demonstrate their class standing in various ways through certain types of consumption of cars and clothes and parties and the like, but also through language. And it was African American Standard English that served that purpose. But as neighborhoods have sort of shifted and segregation patterns have changed, he thinks that variety is dying out. But I believe that there are still going to be ways in which middle-class African Americans want to distinguish themselves linguistically. And so I think that might be what he describes as standard African American English. And so the acquisition of that, I suspect, as with anything, is largely happening below the level of conscious awareness. And perhaps it's not until speakers reach a certain age where they're able to identify the power of that language that they're able to sort of hone that and make it work for them in terms of identity construction. So Lisa's done a lot of work on African American acquisition, and I'll leave it to her to talk about how, what that kind of study might look like. But I think it would be interesting to sort of look at the evolution of that over the age span. I'm not sure I addressed Sandra's question in there. I can't quite remember now what it was.
Well, if she comments in the chat, then I will read it out. John McCulloch asks, do you think there's a generational difference in perceptions of Black speech overall? As in post-Oakland controversy, do younger listeners have a different idea of the nuance between country/urban/pop proper?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So all of this, I think, is generationally bound. And as I said, the sort of pressures that I felt in terms of respectability politics, I think a lot of the students on college campuses these days completely reject. And so I'm seeing the use of the vernacular as part of, sort of academic contexts. You see it in some academic writings. They really are pushing those boundaries. And so not only will those labels sort of shift to reflect that, but the assessment of those labels as positive or negative, I'm sure will shift as well. I wanted to be careful with the way I use the cost and rewards framework because, I'm sort of approaching it from a mainstream perspective, but, it's quite possible that to sound nerdy is seen by many as a reward, right? That is the identity that I'm building. So I didn't want to necessarily suggest that we can impose, these sort of mainstream values on individual values. I think it's important that we allow individuals to sort of determine, how these things get evaluated, and certainly generations to do that work for themselves as well. Okay.
Oh man. Sorry, I'm going to try to choose. Let's see. Toya Wyatt says, great job identifying the one individual in your study who was a military dependent. This is a unique Black speaker community experience. Any thoughts or reflections on how military background status, moving around every 3 years or so, might play a role in the construction of middle-class African-American English identity?
Yeah, so I didn't go out looking for a military dependent. I just found one. I was looking for a proper speaker, and she was suggested to me by someone else. But I do think that military dependents who do have that experience of moving around would be interesting to look at, just, in terms of the level of exposure that they have, not only to different regions of the country and perhaps even different countries, but also to different classes and social statuses, in ways that someone like me, who grew up in a pretty insulated environment and only later in life was exposed to that, would have. So I can see that, being a study in and of itself, but not one that I went out to intentionally pursue.
Okay, I'll just say that from the chat, there's a lot of appreciation for it's a really excellent talk.
Thank you so much. I hope I can see the chat later, but thank you all very much. I appreciate it.